Funding for Firing Line is provided by this station and other public television stations. The Mobil Corporation, Dow Chemical Company, John M. Olin Foundation, Incorporated, Laurel Foundation, Sunstrand Corporation, and the Friends of Firing Line.
Well, 40 years ago, Mortimer Adler published How to Read a Book, and in the volume we'll discuss today, he recalls that none of the 40-odd books he has written since has had a greater response. 2 generations now of people writing in to thank him for increasing their powers of comprehension and taking pleasure from a book. In the course of the furious crusade he has conducted during the past few years to activate the tools of learning and to stimulate the appetite for learning, it came to him that in America time is spent early on in education in teaching students how to read, time is spent in teaching students how to write, but no time is spent in the complementary mode in teaching how to speak and how to listen. These are as crucial to intellectual intercourse as reading and writing, even as, to use his metaphor, the catcher consummates the pitcher's toss. What to say about Professor Adler? Well, I suppose the usual things. He was a whiz at Columbia University, where he took a degree in law, among other things. He went soon to the University of Chicago, where together with Robert Hutchins, great educational experiments were launched. He became the editor-in-chief of the great books and the Encyclopedia Britannica, which he continues to serve. He became the principal figure at the Aspen Institute, which continues to operate. In Chicago, he is director of the Institute of Philosophical Research. He is a dominant figure in American pedagogy. Our examiner today is Mr. Michael Kinsley, the editor of Harper's Magazine, about whom more in due course. I should like to begin by asking Mr. Adler to make a few comparisons and to draw relevant conclusions from English and American training and habits. Do the English tend to listen better?
I think so, but that would require more facts than I have at my disposal. At both Oxford and Cambridge, not in the ordinary county schools, the existence of the Cambridge Union and the Oxford Union, where debating is a regular exercise, which I think is a splendid exercise, by the way, where the student body in the audience of the Oxford or the Cambridge Union are put in the position of voting. The House decides who wins the debate. They listen very well and speak very well. In fact, my experience with academic meetings of all kinds in the United States and abroad, if you have present English academics and American academics, the English academics stand out clearly as much better speakers and listeners than Americans. Now, why that's so, I don't know.
You don't know why. Well, might it have been worthwhile a posteriori to reach back and find out why that was so?
I didn't do it, I'm sorry to say.
So in your book, as we know, you limited yourself to the American experience. Well, does this mean that you accepted the deficiencies in American achievement and simply are attempting to cure those?
I think I would say, Bill, that in general, listening is less well done than reading.
And more
speaking
difficult
is much more difficult. In fact, it requires a much more intense degree of mental application of attention than reading does. And to use the analogy that you mentioned, the pitcher and the catcher, most people think of writing and speaking as active, and listening and reading as passive. Now, obviously, the catcher in the battery is just as active as the pitcher, and he's just as responsible for the play, unless the pitcher throws a wild pitch. Then it's not his fault. And many speakers do the same thing, throw a wild pitch. And the way to test that is, if people read without a pencil in their hand, without a piece of notepaper, without marking the book, without making notes as they read, they're not reading actively. And one of the reasons why I think that television induces passivity is that you watch people watching television. You ever see them with a pad and pencil in front of them, making notes of what they're listening to. And I don't think you can listen actively without the use of some kind of note-taking, which most people don't do.
What you really mean is that the kind of thing that you do when you take notes is the kind of thing you should be doing.
Precisely.
Even if you do it without
That's
pencil
right,
paper.
precisely.
A blind person could listen.
Oh, absolutely. But
Without
it requires
pencil.
that kind of attention, which is
Right.
very, very active indeed.
Okay, now, what is it? What are the responsibilities of the speaker to attract that attention? Should you be able, as a finished listener, to listen to dull people?
No, any more than you should be able to read well a bad book. That is, if the writer hasn't done his job, you can't possibly, just as the catcher can't do anything with a pitcher that isn't a good pitcher. So I think the proportion between the skill of the writer and the skill of the reader is a very important thing to consider. Now, on the other hand, the speaker, when you write something, you know that the reader can turn the pages back, can take his time. He's not enforced by you to follow you at your speed. He can use his own speed, and more than that, it's reversible. He can change the direction of his attention. But when you speak, particularly if you're doing what I'm calling uninterrupted speaking, where you have to listen for a while, that's right. You have to follow my speed. The speed of my speech dictates the speed of your listening, and you can't stop for a moment, go back to the point you made 3 minutes ago, 4 minutes ago. You've got to catch it as it goes along. The flow is in one direction and unending, you see. And so listening is much more difficult than reading because of those differences in the time pattern and in the flow.
Well, sometimes, though, as a matter of duty, you have to read a poorly written book, right?
Yes, you do.
And so you have to get through it. What you're simply saying is it's more laborious, not that it can't be done.
It can't be done. Of course it can't be done. It isn't as profitable either.
Right,
Both
right,
more laborious and not as profitable.
I myself use, I don't know whether I invented it, probably I picked it up somewhere. I use the metaphor downhill. That is to say, some readers, you start off, and from there on it's downhill gravity. The gravity that they produce causes you to go on reading.
That's right.
Others, for whatever reason, either because their syllogisms are uneven or unjustified, or because the rhythm of the sentences is too abrupt, you have to keep climbing, and then your patience
wears out.
Wears out, right?
Indeed.
Right.
The other thing, of course, the most intense activities involved in what I call two-way talk, where you speak and listen, and you know, most conversations are not good two-way talk. Brown remains silent, looking appearing to be attentive while Smith speaks, but merely waiting for Smith to stop, which then is his turn to speak, and he says whatever is in his mind, regardless of what Brown has said before him, and that goes back and forth this way, like two ships passing in the night. At Aspen, where I conduct these executive seminars, I have to say to these top-notch executives who've been to the best universities in the country, do not take a question in a discussion as a stimulus for saying anything on your mind. Be sure you understand the question before you answer it. Well, the first few days, they really do take the question as if merely a stimulus, say anything you want to say, you see. And I say, did you hear the question? And they say, well, would you repeat it? And I'll say, I'll be glad to repeat it as many times as necessary until you've heard it, because there's no point in your answering it until you understand the question I've asked.
Ignoratio elenchi.
Yeah.
Well, your book is designed to be read really at any level,
yes.
But the emphasis on teaching people how to listen ought to come at about the same time that they learn how to read, or later?
Well, I actually think very early. I think it should come very early in the. After all, a good part of the students' time in school is spent listening to teachers, listening to lectures. A good part, I hope, if the Paideia proposal succeeds, a good part of their time will be spent in discussion, in cross-table discussion. And so listening well is indispensable. Now, because it's hard, I think the motivation is important. When I wrote How to Read a Book, in the opening chapter, when I was trying to explain to the reader why one must have a passion for reading, I said, you know, you will understand what I'm trying to say if you have ever read a love letter. Because anyone who's read a love letter has read every word carefully, looked between the lines, over the lines, turn the letter upside down and see if you find anything more there. And so the motivation of the person who has read a love letter is the kind of motivation one should have reading anything worth reading. if your friend, male or female, said to you, "Shall I tell you why I love you?" you would listen very carefully.
Let me count the ways.
Or the other example I thought of was if you're sitting in an airplane crossing the Atlantic, and the pilot comes on the intercom and says, "This is your captain speaking. We are compelled to make an emergency landing in 12 minutes. I'm going to give you instructions, which I wish you to listen to carefully. After I've given these instructions for preparing for this landing,
the cabin
attendants will walk down the line. You can ask them questions. If you follow instructions, there need be no loss of life or injury. Would you listen?" Now, if you can imagine that situation, then that's the kind of intense listening that I think is most profitable of all. Most people don't listen that way. You know, do you listen to a sermon perfectly,
No.
or does your mind wander?
My mind wanders, yeah. My mind wanders. I think probably more self-indulgently than I have any excuse for. But I don't know. I might have missed the Areopagitica. I just don't know.
Yeah.
But some people, I think, do incline more easily to learn from reading than from listening.
Oh, yes. Well, it's easier. It's easier.
For the reasons you cited, and others, yeah.
Yeah.
But what disciplines are there by which students can teach themselves, get into the habit, other than note-taking? Is that the most important?
I think, well, there are 4 questions. If you're listening to a lecture for a moment, either a popular lecture or an academic lecture, the questions you ought to have in mind as the framework which you are paying attention to what is being said is, what is the speaker trying to say? You've got to have some, and his duty should be, at the opening of his speech, is to tell you that, as a matter of fact. If he's making a good speech, if his speaking is orderly and clear, he will have told you at the very beginning, what his aim is. He will tell you at the very beginning, I think, how he's going to do it. First, I'm going to do 3 steps. The first step's going to be the second step, the third step, you see. And then you ought to follow him and see whether he's followed his own outline, if you will. And you are compelled to ask, as you listen, whether his conclusions are well supported, whether what he's saying is true. And finally, I think you ought to, in your own thinking about what you've heard, if it's true, what of it? What consequences follow from it? Now, if the speaker is not orderly, then you've got a harder job.
Okay, yeah. Now, so therefore, you should assume a critical posture, right, when you listen to him.
Yes.
Notwithstanding whether, well, you make the distinction between teachers who try to simply give you information and others who try to change your mind.
That's right.
In which capacity was Mark Antony?
Oh, persuasive.
Yes.
I do make the 2 kinds of speaking, instructive speech and persuasive speech. And there, by the way, I think the 5 Greek words I mentioned are the whole art of persuasive speech. Aristotle said, in any attempt to persuade an audience, it can be a sales talk in a shop, it can be a political oratory, it can be the charge to the jury, they're all the same. They're all attempt to get you to feel one way or think one way or do something. The 5 Greek words, let me mention them first before I say what they mean, is ethos, pathos, logos, taxis, and lexis. And in that order, the element of ethos is, if you're trying to persuade an audience in your speech, you have to establish your own character as attractive, reliable, trustworthy, worth listening to. You must do something at the very opening to get the audience to feel good about you.
Get them into your tent.
That's right. Get them into your tent. Secondly, you have an objective. You want them to vote in a certain way. You want them to decide in a certain way. You want them to buy in a certain way. You've got to get their emotional juices flowing in the direction of the action you want. Only after you've got your ethos established and the emotions moving in the right direction, the pathos, the reasons. If the reasons came first, no one would hear them even. They're prepared to listen by first liking you, first feeling positively toward the objective you're aiming at, and then the reasons.
Well, the trivium puts the reasons ahead of the rhetoric.
Yes, I think that's in persuasive speech, that's the wrong order. See, in instructional speech, perhaps the other order. And then the other 2 things are taxis and lexis. Taxis is, as in the word taxonomy, is the order of the speech. It ought to have a perfectly clear structure. And finally, lexis is style. Now, there are two rules of style that I think sum up all business of writing and speaking. Sam Johnson's rule is the easiest. Good writing, he said, or good speaking, is putting the right word in the right place. Mm-hmm. You can't improve on that, I think. But Aristotle had two rules. He said one should be plain without being, well, one should be clear without being plain, and one should be elevated without being obscure.
Well, to what extent is that the burden of the writer or of the reader?
That's on the side of the writer and the speaker, not the listener or the reader.
Now, as you know, Shakespeare used 28,000 words, 40% of which he used once. Now, if he had used words in common currency, we wouldn't be reading him right now, would we?
Correct.
So therefore, do we simply conclude that an Elizabethan audience was equipped to handle Shakespeare, or that he was simply inspiring them to lengths of effort which permitted him to use this extraordinary vocabulary?
When you think of the kind of audience that came to the Globe Theatre, from the stews around the corner and the cockfights and dog fights.
Half of them were illiterate, probably.
I don't think they understood all his words. I think they were moved by the action more than by the speech. But nevertheless, I think it's true that a careful reader of Shakespeare would say that his style meets Aristotle's. He is clear without being plain, and he's elevated without being obscure.
Well, if he were that clear, why would there be so much exegesis as to what in fact he meant?
I think the exegesis is because there are strange words. You're correct.
Strange words and complicated thoughts.
But strange words for us, they may not have been as strange.
I mean, that's right.
In the Elizabethan vocabulary.
Certain words were more in currency than now.
Yeah.
But some of his thought was complicated too, wasn't it?
Very. He was a great dialectician. The word play, in Romeo and Juliet, some of the word play is absolutely extraordinary. As in Hamlet also. Some of the great scenes are when Polonius and Hamlet are fencing with one another verbally.
That's right. And he's sort of having fun for himself.
Yes, that's right.
But of course, putting the word in the right place,
the right word
in the sense that Shakespeare did it, is to ask people to assume an authority over words that people simply don't have.
That's true.
That's a poet's dowry. Well, you mentioned that it's a combination of being gifted and being trained, one or the other, or both.
Yeah. Now, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think one misunderstanding of these basic skills, reading and writing and speaking and listening, is that you ought to learn the rules. You know, this book contains lots of rules for speaking, lots of rules for listening, lots of rules for carrying on two-way talk, conversation. But if a student were to read this book, or anybody else, and could recite the rules, that would mean nothing. You must have the habit. The rules are only a guide to forming the habit. Imagine a person who cooked with the cookbook in one hand and the spoon in the other, or the driver who tried to drive a car with a driver's manual. The rules are the basis for forming the habit, but you want to throw the rule book away once you've got the habit. And so what you need for any of these skills is, as I think the Paideia proposal insists, is coaching. The rules are the basis of coaching, but you have to do it over practice, and have your imperfect performances corrected, done over again until you get some skill, which is the grace of a habit.
Yeah, it's skill also, though, isn't it, Mr. Adler, in thinking, for instance, the recent election in Chicago caused people to make that classic syllogistic failure. Racists in Chicago voted for Epton, therefore those who voted for Epton were racist.
Yeah, that's known as illicit conversion.
That's right, illicit conversion. Now that that fallacy, widely understood, guards against paralogisms into which people very easily fall when they're listening to a Democratic candidate for president, or people, for instance, who simply assume that any project that they favor is self-financing. What I'm saying is that the kind of rules that you want people to observe are rules that attack not only sloppy use of language, but sloppy use of thought.
Absolutely. And I think that the crux of the matter lies not so much in what I call uninterrupted speaking or silent listening, but in the forum that follows a lecture. I mean, I always regret when I give a lecture, and I've given a great many of them, when I'm not allowed a half an hour of being asked questions, because you don't really know what effect your speech has had on the audience until they ask you questions. And at St. John's College, where I lecture annually, and we have a 2-hour forum after the lecture, I always begin by, particularly if there are new students in the audience, as there are every year, I say, before, I want to sure you understand one thing. I may have said things this evening that you object to, but don't object until you're sure you understood what I've said. Mm-hmm. So please put first the following kind of question. Did I understand you to say that? And only if after I've heard you in your words, repeat what I've said, your words, not my words, and I say, yes, that's what I said, then you're entitled to say, well, I disagree with that, or I object for the following reasons. But if you start to object, and I said, but I didn't say that. Your obligation, first of all, as a listener, is to be sure that you understood what there's no point to conversation, to two-way talk, unless there's some attempt to have a meeting of minds, not agreement. A meeting of minds, we can disagree, but the disagreement must be understood. We can agree, but the agreement must be understood.
Yeah, I understand your point. I think you make it extremely well, and extremely well in this book, giving a lot of examples. But how do you account for the extraordinary effect of certain political statements or orations, which, under your microscope, simply fall apart? I'll give you an example. About 10 years ago, I heard a speech by Senator Dirksen, and just for the fun of it, I did your stunt. I attempted what Professor High calls an intellectual schematic, as though you had the blueprint for electric wiring. Yeah. Where's it going? From here to here, clips onto this, goes to there, clips onto this, then you get the circuit. Yeah. So I did an intellectual schematic, and it was absolutely catastrophic.
No skeleton there at all.
None whatsoever. But at the end, he was flying on a cloudy day low over the middle plains, and he saw the wheat, and he saw the lakes, and so on, and the crowd went wild, delirium. Now, by the same token, so that this won't make me seem partisan, George McGovern, a couple years ago, on a firing line program at Yale, debate on SALT II, drew a theretofore skeptical crowd way over on his side by giving a 3-minute description of what Hiroshima looked like after the bomb fell. Now, my question to you is, why is this so effective, even among audiences that are, technically speaking, inured to those techniques?
I think it is because the listener, and as you say, even a relatively intelligent and trained audience will be guilty of this fault, are pushovers. They don't have, shall I say, the sales resistance. After all, McGovern was making a sale. All persuasive speech is a sales talk. Mm-hmm. And when you listen to a sales talk, whether it's in the shop, you read a sales talk in an advertisement, you hear a sales talk in a political speech, you have to have sales resistance as a listener. Otherwise, you're just yielding, you're acquiescent.
Otherwise, your house is full of encyclopedias.
Right. and that sales resistance consists in being very critical. What kind of wool is he pulling over my eyes? What has he failed to say? He said that, but what does he fail to tell us about, you see? In the book, I suggest a whole series of questions that strengthen your sales resistance to any kind of persuasive speech. It's very important to have that.
Well, is this an act of character, or is this an intellectual act?
I think it's lack of training as a critical, very critical listener. I think you have to be critical as a listener.
Well, these are Yale undergraduates. They probably have an average SAT of 620.
Not a failure of their intelligence. Mm-hmm. It's a failure of their training. Mm-hmm. I don't think, see, as far as I know, of the 4 skills, the only one that's given sufficient attention is writing in the schools, and not very. See, even that is badly taught because of the current, I think, insistence that children should write creatively, competent stories and poems. I don't think we ought to. Creative writing is a fine art, not a liberal art. And I think the kind of writing that should be taught in the schools is expository writing, analytical writing. And what should be taught before the young are taught to write is how to outline. I don't believe anyone can write very well without some kind of either written outline on a piece of paper or an outline in his mind. Reading is not well taught. It's taught, rudimentary reading is taught about the 4th or 6th grade, but the kind of reading that how to read a book is concerned with what the French call explication de texte is not taught in our schools at all. The French are much better taught how to read. Speaking is taught a little bit in public speech courses, but not very much. And listening, not taught at all. At all.
Yeah.
And therefore, and since speaking and listening are correlative in conversation, or what I call two-way talk, most of us converse very poorly. Again, I use my Aspen example. It takes 2 or 3 days with these very bright executives at Aspen to get the discussion to be relevant, to move, to be in gear. People don't know how to talk very well to one another. And since I think conversation is really the heart of human life, I really think...
Is it 46% or something like that?
Yes.
That learning is done by conversation?
Yeah. At the time that How to Read a Book came out, I gave a speech here in New York sometime in which I said that I thought that solitary reading was about as bad an addiction as solitary drinking, and not very pleasant. That when I read a book, I'd like to have someone else read it and talk to and have a conversation about it. I think travel and discussion, any experience in discussion, reading and discussion, viewing a work of art, hearing a musical symphony, I think that discussion, that two-way talk, is really the most...
annealing experience.
The enrichment of human life. I think most marriages dry up because of the failure of conversation. Not sexually, but intellectually dry up. And I think the bonds are between a man and his wife, or one of the difficulties about raising children is that adolescent period when there's a gap in conversation, when you can't talk easily to your children, and they don't talk easily to you. And then when they grow up, the sign of their growing up, getting out of that terrible phase was known as adolescence, is that conversation again becomes a human affair, not a kind of pugilistic affair.
Yeah, right. Well, that's on the matter of these techniques, absent which people find themselves helpless in the hands of a hard salesman.
Yeah.
You have to guard against cynicism, don't you?
Yes. Oh, yes.
You mustn't be so cynical.
So sales resistant that you don't listen at all.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Now, in this passage here from Anthony,
yep.
To what extent was he being dishonest, or was he climbing a dialectical ladder which led from pathos to Lexis?
Well,
in an orderly way and in a way which you would commend.
Well, after all, Brutus and Cassius have already spoken before he's spoken and won the audience. So he can't come in and at once denounce Brutus and Cassius. He says they are honorable men. Of course, they're all honorable men, these people, and I would do them wrong. That prepares the audience to listen to him without having an immediate negative reaction because he has said, shall I say, adverse things about persons they've just listened to and admired. And only gradually in the succeeding speeches does he begin by talking about Caesar's will, and to get them to change their mood from being favorable to Brutus and Cassius to being opposed to them. At the very end, they're out to burn his house. He's raised their tempers to that point.
Well, he uses a lot of rhetorical techniques.
Oh, yes,
they are honorable men when he means they're dishonorable men. They are loyal when he means they're disloyal.
And he asks a lot of rhetorical questions.
He introduces thoughts which he says he's not going to introduce.
That's right.
And he ends up with this classic conversion of the mob.
Yeah.
Well, you have no objection to techniques as long as you recognize them as such, right?
Oh, precisely. Rhetoric. Rhetoric is an indispensable tool in persuasion. And I think one must just make the distinction between rhetoric and sophistry. I think sophistry, the word to say that's sophistical, is to condemn it. To say that's rhetorical is not to condemn it. And I think...
What would be an example of a sophistical...
actually, an illegitimate a piece of false reasoning made to appear to be correct. For example, I think when a person argues ad hominem, when he says that to do that would be like Hitler, you see, using Hitler as if perfectly obvious that anything that you associate with Hitler is wrong, you see. Actually, that may be utterly sophistical because the action may not have that quality at all. See? So that the sophist is a person, as the Greeks said, who made the worse appear the better reason. The rhetorician is not doing exactly that. He is sometimes, his three devices are the enthymeme, which is to do a piece of reasoning with some of the premises left out, the premises assumed, and
which when you assert the premise,
yeah,
the absence becomes obvious.
That's right, yeah. And then using examples, and examples are often prove more than they appear to prove, and finally, of course, the device of asking the rhetorical question, where the rhetorical question is one where the affirmative answer is expected.
That's right. Don't you believe in freedom?
Yes.
Yeah. Don't you believe in the Constitution as an excuse for suppressing civil rights?
Right.
Well, what you complain about in this book about the failure of American schools to teach speaking and listening is something which is how easily correctable?
Not too easily. I think it would have to be begun fairly early, and if the Paideia proposal succeeds in reforming the schools, all of these skills, reading and writing, speaking and listening, and particularly the skills when combined with, they all will converge on a seminar discussion which you have to speak and listen, engage in two-way talk, write about read something as the basis of discussion. If that's begun in kindergarten with fairy stories and fables and carried straight through the 12 years, I think by the time basic schooling is done, these skills can be fairly well formed. They should be carried on in college, of course, also at a higher level. But I think it's possible. When I went to New York public schools at the beginning of the century, before the First World War, I think I was a fairly well-trained writer for a 12-year-old, but by the fact that in the 6th and 7th grade, I was taught to outline and never turn a composition in that didn't have a skeleton, a structure. I don't think most young people are taught to outline anymore at all. In fact, when I was working on the 15th edition of Britannica and produced the Propedia, which is a huge outline of knowledge, I had eminent professors as collaborators and consultants who would turn in outlines that were not outlines, that have one A and no B, or B sub 1 and no 2.
Yeah.
And I said, you can't, an outline is a tree, is a structure, as the body has a skeletal structure.
You gotta have the linkage.
Yeah. So that business of outlining is terribly important, both for writing and speaking, and as well for listening. When you listen, you ought to structure what you've heard. If you just sit back and passively let it go in one ear and out the other, you really haven't heard what is said.
And yes, moreover, you haven't imposed on it a taxonomy on the basis of which you remember what's important and what's trivial.
Precisely.
Well, now you say that it should come very early. Are you suggesting that it would not be a reversible deficiency in an adult who, say, at age 30, recognized that he didn't have these skills?
I mean, in the years that How to Read a Book has been out, it's been used in schools all over the country, but I've had countless letters from adults who claim that they've profited by it in their adult years of learning how to read. I mean, the rules there, that they follow them and put them into practice, they can read better. I think this book will help people to listen better as well as speak better. The book does contain when you first heard Churchill speak during the Second World War, did you think he was speaking extemporaneously as you listened to him?
No, because I couldn't imagine anybody framing those marvelously manicured words extemporaneously.
Yeah, but as he spoke, didn't he seem to be reaching for the next word?
Yes, but that was a rhetorical technique, the stutter.
Yeah. In fact, he had a completely written speech in front of him always. Yeah. But he gave the impression of speaking as he was actually proceeding, as if he were reaching for the next word and forming the next sentence. He didn't have a completely written manuscript. He had a kind of a structured outline to do that with. And I've developed that technique as well.
It's in your appendix.
Yeah, if you give a lecture, a business audience, a political audience, or an academic audience, or a popular audience, and you have a manuscript and read it, it's deadly. To read a manuscript, a fully written manuscript, is almost unlistenable. It's readable. People who do that are writing for readers, not speaking for listeners. So if you're writing a speech of any kind, with some attention to what the difficulty of listening is, you structure it differently, and you put that structure on a piece of paper with short sentences and short paragraphs with indentations and spacing, so that with the notes in front of you, you can turn the page and keep looking up and looking back at the page. If you have paragraphs, you lose your place very easily, unless you sort of, and if you keep looking down, you aren't speaking to the audience and they know you're reading. So that the structured outline is a very good device for effective public speaking.
Well, I think it is, but I think that the other statement you made tends to go a little far, doesn't it? Lincoln read his Cooper Union address, didn't he?
I think so. But he was not a good speaker. He was not, I mean, a
That's
marvelous writer.
Yeah.
You know, probably no one at Gettysburg heard the Gettysburg Address.
Mm-hmm.
He had a high squeaky voice. They had listened to Edward Everett Hale for an hour and a half, 2 hours.
Yeah.
They were cold. They wanted to run behind the tree for a moment. When Lincoln started, the thing couldn't have taken more than 5 minutes to read. Whenever you start to speak, it takes about 3 minutes to get people to hear your voice. You have to. Usually, the opening few remarks should be unimportant because they're not going to hear you anyway. You ought to sort of just get your voice out and get their attention before you begin to say anything. But before anyone listened to that, he was finished. Until they read it in the newspaper, they really hadn't heard it.
Yes. Well, certainly some of the orations of FDR, for instance, all of which were written out, stand in the memory.
Oh, the fireside chats were magnificent.
Yeah.
Now, on the other hand, one of the great orators in British parliamentary history was Edmund Burke, who read Burke's speeches are marvelous prose compositions. But the scholarship on the matter is that when Burke got up to speak, the House of Commons emptied. He spoke to an almost empty house. They said, we'd rather read that than listen to it.
because of the manner of speaking.
It was really written to be read.
What about Webster?
I think Webster was a better orator than Burke, but I don't know.
Yeah. In any event, this appendix here shows how to do it, if that's your inclination.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, you have to be right.
Well, let's hear from Mr. Kinsley, our examiner. Mr. Michael Kinsley is the editor of Harper's, a graduate of Harvard and the Harvard Law School and of Oxford, and before that, the editor of the New Republic, Mr. Kinsley.
Dr. Adler,
Yes.
did I understand you to say that
thank you very much, Mr.
that
Kinsley.
Aristotle said, or I guess I should say, did I understand you to say that you understand Aristotle to have said that persuasive language should be elevated without being obscure?
Yes.
Well, in that case, I wonder if we could just analyze that proposition a bit, using as an example Mr. Buckley. It seems to me that he very often violates your rule and does it very often to very good rhetorical effect. You might say that he's sometimes obscure without being elevated.
But only occasionally.
Only when making indefensible points.
Well, I just wonder if there isn't actually a use for this kind of thing, and maybe he can tell us why he uses these fancy words that he knows perfectly well. A majority of the people in his audience will either have to pretend they understand or go look up.
Well, let me say two things. In the first place, people talk about long words. They don't have to be long to be unusual, right? An adze is an unusual word.
A what?
An ADZE.
And what is it?
It's a thing you chop wood with, sort of skim boats with, but it's not.
Not
long
an
word.
axe, though.
Yeah, no. Now, that's point number one. Point number two is people never are ready with an answer to the question, how come such a word existed if there wasn't a felt need for it? Why would somebody make up a word like, say, velleity, if there wasn't a need to express that?
That was, of course, that was technical jargon in medieval scholastic thought, velleity.
Yeah.
It was good jargon.
Sure. Something this sort of. So it seems to me that simply to forswear the use of words that that arose out of an exquisite sense of their need is to throw away part of your patrimony. Incidentally, you may know this that the Monsignor, what was his name? He translated the Bible. Ronnie Knox.
Yeah,
In his introduction, he says that the King James people took 16 different Greek words and rolled them all into the word righteous. Thus, said he, is setting back ethical scholarship by 2,000 years, i.e. distinctions between righteous and something a little bit different from righteous simply were not observed in that. Now, it made a marvelous rolling word that covered all kinds of insights, ethical insights. But if you were to say, for instance, that all dogs should be called dogs, rather than cocker spaniels or terriers or whatever, you would simply give up an entire species in that taxonomy and be the poorer for it.
Well, this is the fallacy of Esperanto, an attempt to have a nuance-free language. But
for instrumental reasons, it's all right. That is to say, Esperanto is useful in the sense that basic English is useful. If you land in a parachute in France and a German officer comes, it's good to know a few words of German.
I would say that on the side of the art of listening, when a speaker, Mr. Buckley and Kushner, uses a strange word, that gets the audience's attention, by the way. It is attention-getting. And if the audience is a good listener, the people listening are listening well, they make a note of that word and try to find out what it means. If I listen to a speech where someone uses technical jargon, I'm put on notice that I've got to find out what his jargon means to understand what he's saying. But sometimes what is more difficult than the strange
technical jargon or technical words?
When the word is a jargon word, a term of art in a given discipline. But sometimes people use ordinary words with strange meanings, which is more deceptive. It's the duty of the speaker is to say, this word you ordinarily use for this purpose or with this meaning, I'm using it with a very special meaning. His duty is to tell you that special meaning. If he doesn't do that, you've got to spot it as a listener.
Well, can't you pick it up from context?
But sometimes it's hard to do that.
Well, if on occasion Mr. Buckley is tempted to be obscure rather than elevated, you wouldn't necessarily say that that's a worthless rhetorical
No,
advice.
not at all, not at all.
Well, since we're on the subject of Bill Buckley as a speaker, the
I hadn't thought we were doing that.
oh well, I dragged it. I've used up my 2 or 3 minutes to get people's attention. There's of course a very old tradition of public speaking in this country, the Chautauqua Circuit and so on, and it's really a very puzzling institution when you stop to think about it. And I think today probably Bill Buckley is one of the most popular public speakers in America and spends a lot of time doing it. What exactly is the point of going around the country, getting on airplanes, staying in motels, apart from the fact that you're paid for it, but leaving commerce out of it, to stand in front of an audience and say something which you could just as easily write?
I will tell you. I mean,
I've
got an answer to that question. I've done probably as much speaking as Bill has over the years, and I would never give it up. In fact, one of the things I point out in this book, in the last 30 years, I've never written a book that I haven't previously, for a year or two, given in some lecture form. Because unless you speak to an audience and hear their response, hear what they don't understand, hear what troubles them, hear what difficulties you aren't prepared to reach an audience. Right? If you close yourself in the closet and write a book, it will not be very well intentioned for reading. A book that is written after you've given in lecture form, one form or the substance of it, is rhetorically honed down to the bone, I think.
But once you've done that honing, I believe I heard you say before the beginning of the show that you're planning to give a speech tonight,
yes,
which is contained in the appendix to this
right.
book. Wouldn't it be what is the audience going to gain from that speech that they couldn't gain from reading the appendix to your book?
I'll tell you what.
Other than your
I'll tell you. There's another rule of speaking. The lecture is on minds and brains, on the body-mind relationship. There's a lot of very difficult abstractions in it. The book has no gestures. The book has no tones of voice. The book has no facial expressions. When I talk to an audience and become more and more metaphysical and abstract, I put more of my body into it. The audience can follow the abstractions better if it is accompanied by physical gestures and facial expressions and tones of voice that a book can't carry.
If they're appropriate.
Yeah. Oh, it must be
That
appropriate.
was Truman's problem.
That's
remember?
right. He was did this. But I have found that I can make intelligible in speech what is more difficult to understand in writing.
What? You do, Ray?
Yes.
In spite of, you began the program by telling us how much easier it was to read than to listen.
It is. But if on this point, if what you're trying to reach the audience with is a fairly complicated analysis and abstract, somehow, I think, by the way, I think that reading the lecture after you've given it will help the audience understand it better. Enable them to go back and forth in it and mark points. But there's something about oral delivery, if it's well done, that gets their attention, I think, if they, that you have to be something of an orator to do this. You really have to use your tone of voice and your facial expressions and your pauses.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think that a successful orator can sometimes beg the audience for their attention.
Yes.
So he uses a reservoir which is definitely exhaustible, because if he does it and they find that what he has to give them is banal, they won't be there the next time he asks for them. But
right.
They can ask the audience at some point.
It takes a lot. You have to put a lot of energy into it.
Do you think you're more intelligible in person than you are in print?
I think probably I'm doing question period, probably not doing the prepared stuff.
Question period is very important.
Isn't the speech really a form of theater more
Yes,
than
it is.
it's entertainment?
Oh, absolutely.
Don't
wait.
Well, part of the form of theater. I wrote an essay about this at one time. I said, look, anybody who wants to buy National Review can get it for $12, which they could get it for at that time. But if they want somebody other than on television where they get it free, then obviously they want that interaction, which is unique. And for that they pay $3, $4, whatever the ticket people charge. But they are then experiencing a human being in a way for which there's tremendous appetite.
Yep.
Everybody said that the lecture business was going to collapse with television. Quite the contrary.
And I do think you always have forums after the lecture, don't you? You always want to have a question period. I do think the question period, that interchange, if it's well conducted, is very important. That you can't do with an author. You can write him letters and he seldom answers them. But
I once wrote you a letter when I was very young and you answered it.
Why, that's very nice. Did you know what it was about?
I wasn't paying attention when I was reading it.
At any rate, I gave a lecture last night at Mount St. Mary's College in Maryland, and the question period was very good. The thing, I learned a great deal from the question period. In fact, I pointed out that in the years that I've been conducting the executive seminars at Aspen, using the same reading matter, on the whole, conducting the discussion with the same line of questioning, but with different complexion, different chemistry in the group, I have learned a great deal that I wouldn't have learned if I hadn't done that. I learned a great deal from discussion that I can't learn any other way. And I really give the lecture for the sake of hearing the discussion, of finding, because what I find out by listening to the questions is what I haven't said well enough, what I haven't phrased properly, what misunderstandings occur, which you can correct as you go on. I may even tonight learn some things that will make you want to change that appendix in the third printing.
Are they only things that lead you to conclude you haven't communicated well enough, or do they ever lead you to conclude you were actually wrong about something?
They often lead me to conclude that I was wrong. I've changed my mind a good deal. I'm proud of changing my mind.
Oh, now that's a good way to segue into a question that is not directly related to the question of listening, but I can't resist asking. You, of course, are best known, I think, of all your many accomplishments for the Great Book series and the Syntopicon, which organizes all these great books along the theme of 102 great ideas.
Right.
Now, how did you decide that there were exactly 102 great ideas? And have you changed your mind about any of those ideas over the past few decades?
Let me, the two steps to answering the question. First of all, it could have been 125 or 96. For example, virtue could have included all the specific virtues. We have a chapter on temperance, on justice, on prudence, on courage.
On righteousness.
No, not on righteousness. On sin, but not on righteousness.
So how did you pick 102?
Well, 102 is a convenient number. I say it could have been larger or smaller.
Weren't you tempted by 100?
No. I was tempted to avoid 100.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Now, the second point I want to make is Syntopicon was completed, published in 1952. It's now almost 30 years since then. The only idea that is, I think, in the 20th century demanded attention that is not one of the great ideas in that list of 102 is the idea of equality. There's no other idea, I think.
Is that not in there?
No.
It isn't?
No.
How extraordinary. Yeah.
And you know the reason why it isn't in there?
Yeah.
Because in the great tradition of Western thought, that idea comes to the fore and is vividly and vigorously discussed only at the end of the 19th century and the 20th century. It's not in the great books thoroughly.
The people who put out the Michelin Guide, of course, occasionally do just the opposite. They take a 3-star restaurant and they decide it's no longer worth it.
I would drop none of the 102. I'd add equality, but drop nothing.
So it would be 103.
Yeah, 103.
The
I might. There's one I might drop.
Angel?
Fate.
Faith?
Fate.
Oh, fate.
What's gone wrong with Fate over the?
Well, it is a more ancient. It had greatest meaning in the ancient world and in the.
So 19th century references are few to Fate?
Yeah, very few.
Fate is sinking and equality is rising. Well, who in your long experience and the many people you've met, who are the best speakers and also who are the best listeners?
That comes very close to violating a rule of Firing Line, which is no interview type questions. You've got to be thematic.
Thematic?
I don't know that I could.
However, if you want to, you may answer.
Barbara Ward. Let me mention Barbara Ward. You know Barbara Ward, don't you?
R.I.P., yeah.
She could, I've seen her do this, speak for an hour without notes, perfect sentences. You could hear the paragraphs form sequentially. She was an extraordinary speaker. That's a very rare, there are very few people that can do that. Mark Van Doren could never had notes, lectured perfectly, coherently, and with process and clarity, without notes. There aren't many speakers of that caliber.
You're not going to tell me who the worst one was?
I don't. I think I've turned the worst one out of my mind.
Yeah, and of course I won't ask Bill because that would really be violating the rules, right?
Somebody once asked on this program. It was a question put to Woodward and Bernstein just after they had sold 1 million copies of their book. How does it feel to be rich? No, not on Firing Line.
Yeah, I'd like to know. One of the pieces of advice you give to people who are listening is, you said in your executive seminars, is don't use a question as an excuse just to say what's on your mind. Did I understand you to say that is one of the pieces of advice you give to people who are listening?
Use a question as merely the signal to say what's on your mind.
I thought that was very interesting because one of the key things politicians are taught by very expensive media consultants they hire about how to deal with the press, and other people who have to deal with the press are always told by public relations experts is exactly the opposite, which is no matter what question they ask, always say whatever it is you wish to say.
That absolutely frustrates and defeats discussion.
And I think very often on Firing Line, a similar sort of thing happens.
I'm glad you asked me that question because then you give an answer to a completely different question.
Sure.
One of the most important applications of this book, by the way, of these rules of speaking and listening, particularly in two-way conversation, is the improvement of the business conference. If you have any idea how many, take the top executives of this country, I would say they spend 1/3 to 1/2 their time sitting around tables in business conferences, for which the agenda are poorly prepared, which the chairman is too polite to keep the people on the point and insist upon relevance, in which they have meetings in 3 days in a row and don't begin the second meeting with a careful piece of rapporteuring of what happened in the first meeting, which you ought to do for at least 10 or 15 before you start the second meeting to go on. They reach decisions which are based upon misunderstandings. The waste of time and energy of the top executives of this country in business conferences for not listening and not speaking clearly is enormous.
So you're giving them, you give them lessons?
No. The book is instructive about how to avoid that, I would think.
No, he meant when you lecture to them.
Oh, no. Not
well, you suggest how it ought to be done.
Oh, sure.
So as not to waste time.
Precisely.
Right.
Precisely, yes.
I'm out of questions. I guess I wasn't listening hard enough.
Would you agree with, could I ask you a question?
Oh, go ahead.
Sure, go ahead, yeah.
Don't you think that the whole purpose of conversation which most people don't, is what I call the meeting of minds. That there should be, after you and I talk, it isn't the words we're concerned
either
with.
that or the crystallization of differences.
That's well, either understood agreement or understood disagreement.
That's right.
But understanding comes first.
Yeah.
People who disagree with what they don't understand are impertinent, and people who agree with what they don't understand are inane. And inanity and impertinence rules the roost most of the time, I think.
So I should say I agree with you, or I should say I don't agree with you.
Only after you said, "Do I understand you to say?"
Do I understand you to say?
That you're inane?
I guess I must be.
Well, Herman Kahn once said that you can't have a discussion with somebody whose points of view are more than contiguous to your own. You are a pacifist can't really argue with a preventive war type.
There has to be some ground, some common ground.
Some ground, yeah.
And there's another rule. I mean, I never argue with a person about whom I know from past experience that they're never going to, that will not change, that they're deeply prejudiced. It will not change their mind. What is the point of carrying on a discussion with that kind of person?
Socrates had, do you remember that one? The man whom he chided and said he would not continue the discussion unless he would start again.
That's right.
And observe the rules.
For almost any conversation, you ought to pick the right place, the right time, and the right people. You ought to discuss anything with anybody. You ought to know that at least the people you've chosen to carry on the discussion. Right?
Thank you, Mortimer Adler, author of How to Speak, How to Listen. Thank you, Mr. Kinsley. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen of St. Francis.
Funding for Firing Line is provided by this station and other public television stations. The Mobil Corporation, Dow Chemical Company, John M. Olin Foundation, Incorporated, Laurel Foundation, Sunstrand Corporation, and the Friends of Firing Line. This program was produced by Sika, which is solely responsible for its content. For a printed bound transcript of this program, send $2 to Firing Line, Post Office Box 5966, Columbia, South Carolina 29250. Indicate the subject of the program and please allow 3 weeks for delivery.